Okay, I am here in Cashtown, Pennsylvania, about 8 miles to the west of historic Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm standing across the street from the historic Cashtown Inn, which became a inn in 1797. It was established in 1797. And this video series that we're going to do is called the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg. And as we travel eastward toward the town of Gettysburg, we're going to pass the sites that the 13th Alabama did from June 30th, 1863 through July 3rd, 1863, encompassing their entire route along the roads in the battle. We're going to start here in Cashtown on the old Lincoln Highway, which is not the same as the current Lincoln Highway, Route 30. This is the old Route 30. And we're going to do part of this tour in car, since it's going to cover several miles here. Now, on June the 30th, 1863, the 13th Alabama crossed the South Mountain from Chambersburg to our west. And they camped just back here beyond the end on June the 30th, 1863. Now, a little bit about the state of Alabama. The state of Alabama brought approximately 3,000 troops to Gettysburg. The 13th Alabama were members of John J. Archer's brigade, which is basically a Tennessee brigade. Now, the 13th Alabama in this Tennessee brigade was under the command of Henry Harry Heath and his division of the 3rd Brigade. In fact, at 5 a.m. when they broke their camp and left toward Gettysburg, Henry Heath was in need of a hat. And at the time, this little store here was a general store, and it's where Henry Heath purchased the hat that he would later be mortally wounded with in Gettysburg. Now, we're in Cashtown now, heading eastward toward the small town of McKnightstown, was just up ahead. Then beyond McKnightstown, we'll go into Seven Stars. As we do, we'll be passing a lot of historic homes and churches that I'll try to point at. So when you see me go off the road, I'll be pointing at homes that these men of the 13th Alabama would have seen as they proceeded toward the town of Gettysburg. Now, as I said, on the morning of July 1st, 1863, the 13th Alabama, along with some members of the 5th Alabama and Archer's Brigade, broke their camp at 5 a.m. in the morning and headed toward Gettysburg. Now, Archer himself would later be captured on the first day at Gettysburg, fighting along the Emanuel Harmon farm. And it would just so happen that the commanding officer of the 13th Alabama, who was Colonel Burkitt Davenport Fry, and you may have seen his name as Burkitt D. Fry, but his full name was Burkitt Davenport Fry. Burkitt Davenport Fry, would be the brigade commander after Archer was captured at the Emanuel Harmon farm. So the story here from the 13th Alabama takes a bit of a twist, as their commanding officer would be taken from them and placed in command of the brigade. Now, where we're at right now is we're now in the small village town of McKnightstown, Pennsylvania. And McKnightstown is about 7 miles to the west of Gettysburg, and it sits just on the downsloping hillside of the South Mountain Range, which is behind us. Now, just about 1 mile up here ahead on this sycamore-lined dirt road in time of 1863, we are still on what we consider to be the old Route 30, or the old Lincoln Highway. And this was a small one-lane dirt road back in 1863, not the two-lane state road that it is today. Now, of course, to accommodate traffic in the population explosion of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, routes all across the country were built to go through mountain passes and make roads easier traveled by mass transit. And of course, during that time here in Adams County, the old Route 30 was bypassed to the current Route 30. And now that we're in the town of McKnightstown, there will be a lot of, again, old homes and churches that were here that the 13th Alabama passed here on the early morning of July 1st, 1863. This has been the 13th Alabama and their arrival here at Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st, 1863. And as we see the junction up here ahead of us, this is where the old Lincoln Highway meets the current day east and westbound Route 30, or Lincoln Highway. And we will continue eastbound toward the town of Gettysburg in parts 2 and beyond. This has been part 1 of the 13th Alabama and their arrival at Gettysburg. Okay, this is going to be part 2 of the 13th Alabama's arrival at Gettysburg. As they broke the camp and headed toward Gettysburg, around 7 a.m. in the morning, after marching about 4 miles, the Archers Brigade, which contained the 13th Alabama, who were members of Heath's division, the leading division in the march to Gettysburg, around 7 a.m., they approached Marsh Creek. Federal cavalry, who were posted on the right front of the 13th Alabama, were threatening. So a detail of the 13th Alabama and also some men from the 5th Alabama were sent to the front as skirmishers. And when they got to Marsh Creek, the brigade was halted there. And we're going to pick up on the banks of Marsh Creek on our next video on the 13th Alabama arrival. This has been the 13th Alabama and their arrival at Gettysburg. A lot, when we discuss the Battle of Gettysburg, is talked about the very early morning of July 1st, and more specifically, the first shot of the Battle of Gettysburg, who was fired by a man named Marcellus Jones of the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Now, what isn't told a lot about this particular battle is the receiving end of that fire. Much in the same manner of Pickett's Charge, in a book that I had recommended earlier this year by Bruce Malday called Pickett's Charge, The Untold Story. You always hear of the Confederate side of Pickett's Charge, the men charging gloriously across the field, but what about the Union defense of Pickett's Charge? And of course, the 13th Alabama Archer/Fry's Brigade would be a part of the Pickett's Charge on the third day, which we'll show in our later video. But as the 13th Alabama got to this position right here, they encountered the 1st Federal Cavalry on their right front. And today we're standing just about here. We're on the Marsh Creek Bridge, and we're standing about in the position where the 13th Alabama was fired upon by the Federal cavalry, which was just several hundred yards in the front. Of course, this was also the site of the first Battle of Gettysburg that took place less than a week earlier on June 26, 1863. And you can go back and watch my video series entitled The Unknown Battle of Gettysburg, parts 1 through 10, where a small skirmish was take place here right on Marsh Creek on June 26, 1863. Now, to give you a little bit of an idea, even though we're in the area now that the 13th Alabama is, today we have a modern bridge here, which kind of takes away from the view. So I'm going to move over several yards here into the woods and give you guys a sense of what it must have looked like to Heath's division, Archer's Brigade, and of course the focus of this video series, the 13th Alabama. As they approached the bridge on Route 30 at the time, it must have looked very similar to what we're seeing here now. And this is where the brigade was halted before, of course, crossing Marsh Creek. Now, during the Civil War, and in this instance, troops would come to a creek, and very often there were not bridges. Or if there were bridges, they were narrow bridges, and it took a long time for men to cross bridges that way because the troops would simply bottleneck. And when time was of the essence back during the Civil War, more often than none, troops crossed the streams and the creeks on foot. They would basically lift their accoutrements above their waist, hold their guns with both hands above their head, and wade across these small streams, creeks, runs, and even small rivers when they were not deep. And this is the Marsh Creek where the 13th Alabama crossed here early in the morning, about 8:30 to 9 in the morning on the morning of July 1st, 1863. Now, in Archer's Brigade was the 1st, the 4th, the 7th Tennessee, and of course the 13th Alabama. And they crossed this creek, and this is where they were first fired upon. But their first real battle would be several miles up the road, about 2 miles up the road, directly in front of us, at a place called the Emanuel Harmon Farm, which I'm also working on a video series. And you'll want to interconnect these two video series together since the 13th Alabama fought on the Emanuel Harmon Farm. This has been the 13th Alabama and their arrival at Gettysburg. Okay, I am standing here on the Gettysburg Regional Airport, here just along the Chambersburg Pike, and just west of the main portion of the first day's battlefield, which is directly in front of us. And it was here on the morning of July 1st, 1863, that the 13th Alabama crossed across these very grounds today, which are an airport, which you can see here in the distance. They crossed in this direction here and headed toward and into the town of Gettysburg. They would be slightly engaged back here a few miles at the Marsh Creek Bridge as they were first fired on by the Federal cavalry. And of course, with overwhelming numbers from Heath's division heading and driving here eastward toward the town, that Federal cavalry was forced back toward the Lutheran seminary, where they would then warn John Buford about the oncoming rebels, and in turn John Buford would send messengers out to John F. Reynolds and the 1st Corps and O.O. Howard and the 11th Corps to get to Gettysburg with all possible speed with their infantry divisions so they could meet this attack here. And it's ironic today that we have an airport here in Gettysburg on grounds, of course, where you could say fighting was taking place. However, the skirmishing that took place here just west of here, in between that and the next video series that we're going to do on the 13th Alabama, which is going to be on the Emanuel Harmon farm property, those two areas this was skirmishing, and this was some more skirmishing, and the first taste of real battle. Where we're standing right now would have been a slight lull in the battle here on the morning of July 1st, 1863. This has been the 13th Alabama, Part 4. The 13th Alabama, Part 5, and we're standing here on the Emanuel Harmon farm, and it was here in the morning of July 1st, 1863, the Archers Brigade advanced into the field which contained the 13th Alabama. Now, the 13th Alabama came from the direction in front of our camera and swung by the Emanuel Harmon farm in this direction toward the Herbst property, which was just across Willoughby Run, which is in front of us. The 13th Alabama advanced here under the command of Burkett Davenport Fry. They also had a detachment of the 13th Alabama, which was used as a skirmish line in front of the brigade and in front of the men of the 13th Alabama. This has been 13th Alabama, Arrival at Gettysburg, Part 5. Okay, this is the 13th Alabama and their arrival at Gettysburg, Part 6. 13th Alabama, under Archer, coming toward where the camera's facing now, crossed Willoughby Run right here and became a part of an assault on Solomon Meredith's Iron Brigade. They slammed right into the 24th Michigan and 19th Indiana, and they assaulted them several hundred yards here in front of the creek before federal reinforcements pushed them back. Now, while the 13th Alabama was being pushed back toward the camera now, with the run, Willoughby Run, to their backs, many of the men in the 13th Alabama were unable to escape and were captured just up here on the high end of the bank of Willoughby Run. This has been the 13th Alabama, Part 6. Alabama at Gettysburg, Part 7. As the 13th Alabama, who were members of Archer's Brigade, begun to get engaged with the Iron Brigade and were forced back. And in Part 6 we talked about them not all of them being able to cross Willoughby Run with the run to their back, and a lot of them were captured just in the distance beyond our camera, past these trees on the other side of the run. They were captured. The brigade, including the 13th Alabama, the ones that were able to recross the run and move back in this direction here on the on ground that was being held by the 1st Tennessee as they crossed. And they were in this area right here when, just to their left in the distance, their commanding officer, James J. Archer, was captured not too far from this tree. Now, of course, when he was captured, he was in command of the brigade. Command of the brigade then turned over to Burkett Davenport Fry, who was leading the 13th Alabama Regiment here at Gettysburg. So, of course, Fry's taken away from the 13th Alabama at this point, and you'll find we'll see it in a later video that the 13th Alabama, with the former Archer, now Fry's brigade, gets reformed as John M. Brockenball and James Pettigrew come into position to support another attack on Willoughby Run. This has been the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg, Part 7. Here on Lakeview Drive, and our camera is facing north directly in front of us on July 1st, 1863, just beyond these trees. Is the Old Mill Road, and right directly north of us would have been the Emanuel Harmon farm. And this is going to be the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg, Part 8. We left off in Part 7 where the 13th Alabama had reformed after they received support from Brockenball and Pettigrew, and that was in the distance here to the northwest. And what happened was the 13th Alabama fell behind those two regiments and reformed their regiment, moving southward into the direction of the Peter Stallsmith's farm, which would have sat where our camera's facing here behind this house in the field. Today, this whole area has been redeveloped and newer homes built. Now, the 13th Alabama began advancing eastward in this direction through the Peter Stallsmith farm and toward the town of Gettysburg. And then when they got about to this point, and I'm standing here between the house number 36 and 55 Lakeview Drive, when they got to about this point, they then turned southward a little bit toward the Fairfield Road, which goes in this direction. Now, directly in front of them was the 8th Illinois Cavalry. And about at that time that they turned south toward them, the cavalry actually began to march to their right flank eastward. Of course, then the 13th Alabama turned once again and began to head eastward toward the town of Gettysburg. This has been the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg, Part 8. Okay, this is going to be the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg, Part 9. And we just left off in Part 8 where the 13th Alabama turns slightly southward near the Peter Stallsmith farm and then began to head eastward. Now that video was shot here in the distance. Right up here on the right is Reynolds Avenue off of the Fairfield Road. And then just beyond that would be Old Mill and the Armory. Where that armory sits, the 13th Alabama headed eastward in this direction in the afternoon of July 1st, 1863, after their action on the Harmon farm, and then their march as they reformed near the Stallsmith farm and headed eastward. They probably took this road, which is the Fairfield Road, eastway in this direction, to about this point here. Now this is the corner of Fairfield and Reading Lane here in Gettysburg, and this is 1036, this house here in front of us. At this time, they headed in a southeast direction by this house here over to Seminary Ridge, which Seminary Ridge runs from the Lutheran Theological Seminary southward down this way, and today what is Confederate Avenue. They headed over toward what is today Confederate Avenue to their final position. Now on the day of July 2nd, the 13th Alabama did not see any action. They were held in reserve over on the ridge. And of course they would be re-engaged in action again on July 3rd, 1863, as we'll talk about in our next video. This has been the 13th Alabama and their final position here on July 1st, 1863, as they headed eastward down the Fairfield Road, right here about where Reading Lane is, and then headed to the ridge above them. This has been the 13th Alabama, Part 9. This is the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg, Part 10, our final part here in our 13th Alabama's Arrival at Gettysburg video series. On Part 9, we left off at Reading Lane, which is directly in the western direction to the northwest, just beyond these trees, which would be the Fairfield Road. So I'm going to make some point of references. Fairfield Road comes up to here. In this direction would be the Lutheran Seminary, and then from the Lutheran Seminary you can take West Confederate Avenue right up here. Now when you get to the North Carolina Monument over here, and then of course just beyond this little marker is the Tennessee Monument. That's where you want to pull over, and then you just walk here westward to this fence. The 13th Alabama, after crossing the Fairfield Road in the direction from our last video, crossed the woods and the fields eastward toward the southeast here of Gettysburg. And they made their way into this direction. Now today there's a lot of open farmland out here, and then just here to the west of Confederate Avenue is a horse trail that's used for riding horses on the battlefield today. And I'm standing here and I'm going to turn the camera east into the scene, and we're on July 3rd, 1863 now, and it is about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it is about to began the action that we know as Pickett's Charge. There's a large cannonade between several hundred cannon in the Confederacy versus another 150, 160 from the Union side. And this cannonade lasts approximately 2 hours. After the 2 hours is expired, what we know as Pickett's Charge or Longstreet's Assault begins to happen here just before 3 o'clock on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863. The Alabama in Archer's brigade, now under the command of Burkett, Davenport, Fry, began marching here during this assault of Longstreet, and they are in Pettigrew's Trimble's charge. Now, at the same time, you have Pickett himself with the Virginians near where General Lee is to our south. To the left, Brock and Brawl's brigade is further to our north, and then of course Pettigrew in this direction here near where the North Carolina Monument is with the North Carolinians. Archer's / Fry's brigade rather, begins their march in this famous assault of Longstreet known as Pickett's Charge in this direction. And as we get up here closer to the road, I'm going to turn and we're going to look at the brigade marker, which will explain everything that we went through on the first 9 videos. Talks about the second day, them being in reserve, and of course the third day, this charge here, and then of course their retreat on July 4th. If you stand here on West Confederate Avenue, just beyond the Tennessee Monument, you'll see the brigade marker, one of 2 of them on the battlefield for Archer's brigade, and it says, Archer's Brigade, 5th Battalion, 13th Alabama, 1st, 7th, 14th Tennessee Infantry. Reached the field in the morning. The battalion was ordered to watch cavalry on the right, the 8th Illinois Cavalry, which we went over in our other video. The 4 regiments advancing into Reynolds Woods, where it were met and flanked by the 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Corps, the Iron Brigade, shown in our first few videos. It fell back across the run, losing 75 prisoners, including Brigadier General Archer. So on the 2nd, in the evening, marched from the woods west of Willoughby Run and took a position near here. July 3rd, in Longstreet's assault, it was the right brigade of Pettigrew's division advanced to the stone wall at the angle, and some of the men leaped over it. It had 13 color bearers shot, 4 of them at the wall, lost 4 of the 5 flags and 5 of the 7 field officers. And on July 4th, they withdrew and began the march toward Hagerstown, Maryland. Now, one thing I would like to point out, just before, on the night of the 2nd, and the morning of the 3rd, earthworks were dug by some of the members of Archer's brigade. And if you look here at this line of trees today, you'll see the rise in the ground, and these are the remnants of the earthworks that the 13th Alabama helped to construct with the Tennessee soldiers that they were in. They were basically in a Tennessee regiment. They didn't fight alongside of most of the 6,000 Alabamans that fought here. I just thought this was a neat little tidbit to put here, that you can stand here in the earthworks near where the 13th Alabama participated in building it. On July 3rd, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, finally the infantry assault is launched after the nearly 2-hour cannonade. And the 13th Alabama, as a member of Archer's brigade / Fry's brigade, begins their advance across the fields here. As the brigade marker states, they march straight across this field here, and in the distance you can see the copse of trees here, okay, which is this larger set of trees, and then this smaller tree here represents the angle. Several men from the brigade, and probably some from the 13th Alabama, made it to the wall at the angle and crossed over the wall before being beaten back. Now, if I turn to my left, so you'll know where we're standing, this is the Tennessee Monument in front of us. So we're just about 200 yards south of the Tennessee Monument in the fields where the 13th Alabama charged. During this charge, Fry, who was in command of the brigade, was wounded and captured. And then the command went to an officer from the 7th Tennessee. The 13th Alabama was actually one of the four out of 5 flags that were captured during this action here, known as Pickett's Charge, of part what they were in the Pettigrew-Trimble Charge. This has been the 13th Alabama, Part 10, our final part, looking at the 13th Alabama from the evening of June 30th, camped in Cashtown, to July 4th when they withdrew from this position and headed back toward Hagerstown in the retreat of General Lee's army. This has been the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg.